The sun streamed through the large windows of Moonlight Bistro, catching the crystal glasses that lined the tables. It was the lunch rush, and the restaurant hummed with conversation and the clinking of silverware. Rose had been on her feet for 6 hours already, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, a genuine smile on her face despite her exhaustion. She balanced 3 plates along her arm while refilling water glasses at table 7 when the front door swung open. In walked Diane Matthews, dripping in jewelry and wrapped in a designer outfit that probably cost more than Rose's monthly rent. The hostess led Diane to a corner table in Rose's section. "Finally, some service," Diane said loudly as Rose approached, not bothering to look up from her phone. "I'll have the salmon, but I want it prepared with olive oil instead of butter, no salt, and I want the chef to grill it exactly 4 minutes on each side." Rose nodded politely. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'd be happy to put in your order, but I should mention that our salmon dish comes with a special house marinade that's prepared in advance. I can ask if they can accommodate some changes." Diane's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "Are you telling me no? Do you have any idea who I am?" Several diners at nearby tables glanced over. Rose kept her voice steady. "Not at all, ma'am. I'm just letting you know what might be possible with our menu. Let me check with the kitchen about your requests." "Don't bother," Diane scoffed, looking Rose up and down. "I suppose someone in your position wouldn't understand quality anyway. Look at your shoes. They're practically falling apart. I guess that's what happens when you choose to serve people for a living instead of getting a real career." A flush crept up Rose's neck, but her smile never faltered. She was putting herself through nursing school with this job, but Diane didn't need to know that. An older gentleman at the next table frowned at Diane's comments. Rose took Diane's order despite the insults and headed to the kitchen. When she returned 15 minutes later with the perfectly plated salmon, Diane barely glanced at it before pushing it away. "This is overcooked. It's completely dry. Did you even give them my instructions?" Diane's voice carried through the restaurant as she pointed at the dish. "This is completely ineatable." Rose looked at the salmon. It was glistening and perfectly flaky. "I'm sorry it's not to your liking, ma'am. I'd be happy to have the kitchen prepare another for you." "You think I have time for that?" Diane stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is exactly what happens when restaurants hire people who can't even get simple instructions right. What happened next left the entire restaurant in shock. Diane's hand swung forward, connecting with Rose's cheek with a sharp crack. Rose stumbled backward, nearly dropping her serving tray, her hand flying to her face. "People like you need to learn some respect," Diane hissed. The restaurant fell completely silent. Rose stood frozen, her cheek burning red, eyes wide with disbelief. Then she noticed something. At least 3 people had their phones out, recording the incident. One was a woman in a business suit who hadn't taken her finger off the record button. Another was a middle-aged man in casual clothes who looked absolutely furious. Little did Diane know, her impulsive act of cruelty had just been captured from multiple angles, and in the age of social media, actions like hers never stayed private for long. As Rose quietly excused herself to the back room to collect herself, Diane returned to her seat, completely unaware that her life was about to change forever. The entire restaurant seemed frozen in time after Diane's hand struck Rose's cheek. For a moment, no one moved. Waiters paused mid-step, diners held forks suspended in air, and the soft piano music playing overhead suddenly felt too cheerful for what had just happened. Rose stood there, her hand touching the spot where Diane had slapped her, a red mark already forming. Her eyes watered, but she didn't cry. 6 years of working in restaurants had taught her how to handle difficult customers, but nothing had prepared her for physical assault. "I'm going to need you to leave," came a firm voice. It was Kevin, the restaurant manager, a tall man with kind eyes, who had watched the whole thing unfold from across the room. He now stood beside Rose, his hand gently on her shoulder. Diane looked genuinely surprised, as if she couldn't believe anyone would dare ask her to exit the premises. "Excuse me? Do you know who my husband is? He practically owns half the commercial real estate in this district." "I don't care if your husband owns the moon," Kevin replied calmly. "You just assaulted my employee. I've already called security, and they're on their way. You can either leave now on your own or be escorted out. Your choice." A woman from a nearby table stood up, Lisa Chang, though Diane didn't recognize her as the district attorney who had recently won several high-profile cases. "I witnessed everything," Lisa said, holding up her phone. "And I have it on video. That was assault, plain and simple." Diane's face flushed red, but her chin tilted upward in defiance. "It was hardly a tap. These service people need to learn their place, and recording me without permission. I could sue you for that." A murmur ran through the restaurant. The man in casual clothes, who happened to be Tom Wilson, CEO of Horizon Technologies, also stood up. "Public place, ma'am. No expectation of privacy. And I caught it from another angle, just to be thorough." Diane gathered her designer purse, huffing as she pushed past Kevin. "This place is going downhill anyway. You'll be hearing from my lawyers." She stormed toward the exit, her heels clicking loudly on the tile floor. As she left, something extraordinary happened. One by one, diners began to applaud, not loudly or mockingly, but in a show of quiet solidarity with Rose. An elderly couple at table 6 left a $100 tip. The businessman on a lunch meeting asked for Rose's name so that he could mention her composure in his positive review. In the back office, Rose sat with an ice pack against her cheek while Kevin filled out an incident report. "I've never been hit before," she said quietly. "Not by anyone, let alone a customer." "You handled it with incredible grace," Kevin told her. "But this isn't over. We have a zero-tolerance policy for abuse of any kind against our staff. We'll support you if you want to press charges." Rose nodded slowly. "I think I do. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been treated like they're less than human just because they're serving someone." What Diane couldn't have known was that she had just assaulted someone who was not only well-liked in the community, but also 3 months away from completing her nursing degree. Rose volunteered at the Children's Hospital on weekends and had recently organized a fundraiser for a local shelter. She wasn't just the help, she was someone deeply connected to the very community Diane claimed her husband had influence over. Outside, Diane climbed into her luxury car, slamming the door and checking her makeup in the mirror. She noticed a small notification on her phone. Someone had tagged her in a post, then another, and another. Her perfect, curated social media presence was about to implode as the video spread from phone to phone. By the time she arrived home to her expensive hillside mansion, #Justice for Rose was already beginning to trend locally, and the first news van was preparing to go live outside Moonlight Bistro. Diane's moment of cruelty was just starting its journey across the internet, and her comfortable world was about to be turned upside down. Diane arrived home to her sprawling mansion, tossing her keys to the housekeeper without a second glance. Her phone had been buzzing nonstop, but she ignored it. Rich people always had their critics, probably just some jealous nobodies trying to ruin her day. She kicked off her designer heels and poured herself a glass of expensive wine. "Mrs. Matthews," her housekeeper said hesitantly, "your husband called. He said it's urgent that you call him back right away." Diane rolled her eyes. What could possibly be so urgent? Did the stock market crash? She laughed at her own joke, but the housekeeper didn't smile. "He mentioned something about a video going viral." Diane's hand froze mid-sip. She grabbed her phone and finally looked at the notifications flooding her screen. Her stomach dropped as she saw a screenshot of herself, hand raised, face twisted in anger, with Rose's shocked expression clearly visible. The video had already been viewed over 100,000 times. Meanwhile, back at the restaurant, Rose was surprised to see Lisa Chang waiting for her outside the manager's office. "I don't mean to intrude," Lisa said, handing Rose her business card. "But I'm a district attorney, and what happened to you was clearly assault. If you want to press charges, I'd be happy to point you in the right direction." Rose studied the card. "Thank you. I think I will." As they talked, Tom Wilson approached. He'd stayed behind, postponing his afternoon meetings. He introduced himself not as a CEO, but simply as someone who wanted to help. "The way you handled yourself was remarkable," he told Rose. "I'm actually in the process of launching a foundation focused on workplace dignity and preventing abuse of service workers. We need people like you who understand these issues firsthand." Rose laughed softly. "Me? I'm just a waitress trying to get through nursing school." "You're much more than just anything," Tom replied. How about we schedule a proper meeting next week? I think you'd be perfect as an advocate for our cause. Across town, Diane's comfortable world was crumbling around her. Her husband Robert stormed through the front door, face red with anger and fear. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he shouted, throwing his phone on the marble counter. "That video is everywhere. The board is calling an emergency meeting. Lux Beauty is talking about ending your spokesperson contract. What were you thinking?" She was disrespectful, Diane said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "She was doing her job, and you assaulted her on camera." Robert paced the kitchen. "Our PR team is in damage control, but this is bad, Diane, really bad." Diane's phone rang. It was her friend Charlotte from the country club. She answered, expecting sympathy. "I can't believe what I'm seeing," Charlotte said, her voice cold. "The charity gala committee is unanimous. We don't want you chairing next month's event anymore." "What?" "Over one little incident," Diane spluttered. "Little? You hit a working woman just trying to do her job. Half the committee members have been servers at some point in their lives. This isn't a little incident, it's who you are." The line went dead. Diane stared at her phone in disbelief. Charlotte had been her friend for 15 years. By evening, Rose returned to her small apartment, emotionally drained but somehow stronger. Her roommate had made dinner and set up their tiny living room with ice cream and movies. "You're basically famous," her roommate said, showing her the video that had now reached millions of views. "People are calling you a hero for not losing your cool." Rose shook her head. "I'm not a hero. I just didn't want to sink to her level." Her phone pinged with a text from her mom. "So proud of you, honey. For your restraint today and for everything you do. Don't let anyone make you feel small." Rose smiled, the sting of Diane's insults fading with each supportive message from friends, regular customers, and now strangers from across the country. In the Matthews mansion, Diane sat alone in her home office, scrolling through endless comments condemning her behavior. Robert had retreated to the guest room, saying he needed space. Her publicist had sent a drafted apology statement that felt hollow even to her. For the first time, Diane's wealth and status couldn't shield her from consequences. She stared at the dark window, seeing her reflection, designer clothes, perfect hair, and an expression she didn't recognize: fear. The connections that would change both women's lives had been set in motion. What Diane saw as the worst day of her life was just the beginning of a journey neither woman could have predicted. And for Rose, the slap that was meant to put her in her place had instead opened a door to possibilities she never imagined. Morning sunlight streamed through Rose's apartment window as she sipped her coffee, trying to prepare herself for the day ahead. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since she woke up. 3 days had passed since the incident, and somehow things were only getting more intense. "You've got another news request," her roommate called from the couch, scrolling through their shared laptop. "Channel 8 wants to interview you for their evening segment." Rose shook her head. "I can't believe this is still going. I just want things to go back to normal." But normal seemed impossible now. The video had been viewed over 8 million times. #JusticeForRose was trending nationally. Celebrities were sharing the clip with messages about respecting service workers. Even a famous talk show host had mentioned it, saying, "This is what happens when wealth disconnects you from basic human decency." Rose's phone rang. It was Kevin from the restaurant. "How's the cheek?" he asked when she answered. "The bruise is turning yellow now. Much better," Rose replied. "Listen, I wanted to warn you before you came in for your shift. There are reporters camped outside the restaurant, and we've been flooded with reservations from people hoping to sit in your section. It's a bit of a circus." Rose sighed. "Maybe I should take a few days off until this dies down." "Actually," Kevin said carefully, "the owner wanted me to tell you that you're welcome to paid leave for as long as you need. He also mentioned something about a college fund donation for your nursing program." Rose's eyes widened. Wow. Tell him thank you." After hanging up, Rose opened her email to find a formal message from Lisa Chung at the district attorney's office, confirming that charges had been filed against Diane Matthews for assault. There would be a court date set soon, and Rose would need to testify. Across town, Diane sat in her lawyer's office, a stern-faced woman named Patricia who didn't seem impressed by Diane's family connections or wealth. The situation is straightforward, Patricia said, arranging papers on her desk. You assaulted a woman in a public place. It was captured on video from multiple angles. There were dozens of witnesses. The district attorney is pressing charges. Can't we just settle this quietly? Diane asked, fidgeting with her wedding ring. The past 3 days had been a nightmare. Lux Beauty had officially terminated her spokesperson contract. Her social media accounts were flooded with hateful messages. Worst of all, her husband Robert was barely speaking to her, spending most of his time at their beach house. Ms. Chen doesn't want money, Patricia replied, referring to Rose by her last name. She wants her day in court. And given the evidence, I have to be honest, you'll likely face in community service at minimum. Diane blanched. Community service? Like picking up trash on the highway? People would see me. Patricia's expression remained neutral. That's generally the point of community service, Mrs. Matthews. Outside the lawyer's office, Diane pulled her sunglasses down over her eyes and hurried to her car, but not before a photographer spotted her. The camera flashed as she ducked into the driver's seat. Later that afternoon, Rose met with Tom Wilson at a quiet cafe far from the restaurant. He brought along his project coordinator, a woman with a warm smile who took detailed notes as Tom explained his vision for the Workplace Dignity Foundation. We want to create real change in how service workers are treated, Tom explained. Training programs for businesses, resources for workers who face abuse, lobbying for better legal protections. And we need someone who understands these issues firsthand to help shape our approach. Rose stirred her tea thoughtfully. And you think that could be me? I think you're exactly what we need. Your nursing background gives you healthcare insight, your restaurant experience covers service work, and the way you handled yourself shows remarkable character. We're offering you a full-time position once you graduate, with a salary that would cover a comfortable apartment closer to the hospital district. Rose's hand trembled slightly. This is a lot to take in. Take your time, Tom said. The offer stands regardless of what happens with the court case. That evening, Rose returned to her apartment to find a delivery waiting, a beautiful bouquet of flowers from her fellow waitstaff at Moonlight Bistro, with a card signed by everyone. Even the stern head chef had written a message, "Nobody messes with our Rose. We've got your back." Meanwhile, Diane sat alone in her empty mansion, staring at the drafted statement her publicist had prepared. The carefully worded apology felt hollow, like everything else in her perfectly curated life. She deleted it and began typing her own words for the first time in years, tears streaming down her face as she confronted the truth about who she had become. Outside, rain began to fall on both women's homes, one small apartment filled with love and support, one massive house empty except for its lonely occupant. The storm was passing for Rose, but for Diane, it was just beginning. 2 weeks after the incident, Rose walked into the courtroom wearing the one formal outfit she owned, a navy blue dress she'd bought for her cousin's wedding last year. Her mother sat in the front row, along with Kevin from the restaurant and several co-workers who had taken the morning off to show support. Diane entered from the opposite side, wearing a subdued grey pantsuit instead of her usual flashy designer clothes. Her hair was pulled back in a simple style, and she wore minimal makeup. The transformation was striking. Gone was the haughty socialite, replaced by someone who looked humbled. Robert walked a step behind her, his face tense. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harris called the session to order. Rose's heart pounded as she was called to testify first. She described the incident clearly, without embellishment or anger, just as it had happened. "And how has this affected you?" the prosecutor asked. Rose took a deep breath. Physically, the bruise healed quickly. Emotionally, it's been complicated. I've received incredible support, but also unwanted attention. I've had to take time off work, which affected my income. And I still feel anxious when approaching customers I don't know. When it was Diane's turn to speak, she surprised everyone by declining her lawyer's help. She stood, hands trembling slightly as she faced the judge. "I won't waste the court's time with excuses," she began, her voice softer than Rose had ever heard it. "The video shows exactly what happened. I behaved abominably. I struck someone who was simply doing her job with grace and professionalism." She turned toward Rose. "I am deeply sorry. My actions were inexcusable." Judge Harris studied Diane for a long moment before announcing her decision. Mrs. Matthews, this court sentences you to 200 hours of community service at Hope Community Center, which serves meals to homeless and low-income individuals. You will also attend 20 sessions of anger management therapy. Additionally, you will pay a fine of $5,000, which will be donated to an organization supporting service industry workers. Diane nodded, accepting the sentence without protest. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around both women. Rose made a brief statement. "I hope this case reminds people that service workers deserve basic human dignity and respect. No one should face abuse for doing their job." As Rose turned to leave, she felt a hand on her arm. It was Diane. "Could I speak with you privately?" Diane asked quietly. Rose hesitated, then nodded. They stepped away from the cameras to a quiet corner of the courthouse steps. "I wanted to apologize again, away from the courtroom and cameras," Diane said. "Since that day, I've lost my spokesperson contract, most of my friends, and nearly my marriage. But the worst part is realizing what kind of person I had become." Rose studied the woman before her. "Why did you do it?" "I was just trying to help you." Diane's eyes filled with tears. "I don't have a good answer. For years, I've measured my worth by my wealth and status. I treated people like props in my perfect life. When you couldn't give me exactly what I wanted, something just snapped." She wiped her eyes. "It's no excuse. I just want you to know I'll be living with the shame of what I did for the rest of my life." Rose nodded slowly. "I hope your community service teaches you what I already know, that a person's job doesn't determine their worth." That evening, Rose had dinner with Tom to formally accept his job offer with the Workplace Dignity Foundation. They toasted with sparkling cider as he outlined her first project, developing training materials to help restaurants create safer environments for their staff. Meanwhile, Diane stood nervously at the entrance of Hope Community Center, reporting for her first day of community service. The coordinator handed her an apron and hairnet. "You'll be serving on a line today," the coordinator explained. "Just smile, be polite, and remember, everyone who comes through that door deserves respect, no matter their circumstances." Diane tied the apron with shaking hands. As the doors opened and people began to file in for dinner, she took a deep breath and picked up the serving spoon. For the first time in her adult life, Diane Matthews was about to serve others, instead of expecting to be served. The journey of both women had taken an unexpected turn. For Rose, a painful moment had opened the door to new opportunities. And for Diane, the worst mistake of her life had become the first step toward becoming someone new, someone better. Diane shifted uncomfortably in her plastic chair as the anger management group formed a circle. It was her 5th session, and she still felt out of place among the diverse group of participants. A construction worker with tattoos covering his arms. A young mother who spoke too loudly. A retired teacher who couldn't control his road rage. And her, the wealthy socialite who had slapped a waitress and become internet infamous. "Today we're discussing triggers," said Gabriella, the therapist leading the group. "What situations make you feel like you're losing control?" When Diane's turn came, she hesitated. 2 months ago, she would have dismissed the entire exercise as beneath her. Now she found herself speaking honestly. I get angry when I feel invisible," she admitted. "All my life, I've used money and status to make people see me. At that restaurant, when Rose couldn't give me exactly what I wanted, it felt like she was dismissing me, like I didn't matter." Gabriella nodded encouragingly. "That's excellent insight, Diane. Many of us react with anger when we feel our worth is being questioned." After the session, Diane drove directly to Hope Community Center for her community service hours. She'd been working there 3 days a week for a month now. At first, she'd been terrified of the neighborhood, of the people, of doing manual labor. Now, she found herself looking forward to it in a way she couldn't quite explain. "There's our fancy chef," called Miguel, the kitchen supervisor, as Diane tied on her apron. "I saved the special spices for you today." Diane smiled, surprised to realize it felt genuine. Last week, she'd suggested improving the bland soup with herbs from her garden. The residents had loved it, and now Miguel teased her about her gourmet touch. "How many coming tonight?" she asked, rolling up her sleeves. "Around 80. More if the weather turns cold." Diane nodded and got to work chopping vegetables. Her manicured hands, once perfect, now showed small nicks and calluses. Strangely, she felt a hint of pride in these small marks. Across town, Rose was giving a presentation to restaurant owners and managers, standing confidently at the front of a hotel conference room. "The incident that happened to me went viral because it was extreme," she explained, "but service workers face less visible forms of abuse every day. Our program helps create protocols to protect your staff while improving customer experience." Tom Wilson nodded encouragingly from the back of the room. In just 2 months, Rose had developed a comprehensive training program that was already getting attention from major restaurant chains. She had officially graduated from nursing school, but had postponed her hospital job to focus on the foundation work that felt increasingly important. After the presentation, several restaurant owners approached to schedule trainings. One older man lingered until the others had left. "I've owned my place for 30 years, he said, "and I'm embarrassed to admit I've never had a system for when customers mistreat my staff. I just expected them to handle it." He shook Rose's hand firmly. "Thank you for doing this work. It's long overdue." That evening, Rose met with Lisa Chang from the district attorney's office for coffee. They had become friends since the court case, with Lisa serving as an informal mentor. "You know, I've been prosecuting cases for 15 years, Lisa said, stirring her latte. "But yours was special. It's rare to see such clear consequences for bad behavior, especially from someone wealthy and connected." Rose nodded. "I've been wondering how she's doing with her community service. It's been 2 months." "You could find out," Lisa suggested. "The Hope Center director is an old friend of mine. She says your Ms. Matthews has been surprising everyone." Later that night, Diane sat at her kitchen table, looking through old photo albums. Robert was working late again. Their marriage was mending slowly, with weekly counseling sessions. He was cautiously supportive of her community service work, though clearly skeptical that the changes in her would last. Diane paused at a college photo of herself, smiling casual, sitting with classmates on a dormitory floor. When had she lost that version of herself? When had status and appearances become her entire identity? Her phone pinged with a text from Miguel. "Soup was a hit again today. You've got the touch." A simple message that would have seemed meaningless to the old Diane. Now it made her smile and feel something she hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of having genuinely helped others. No cameras, no social media posts, no recognition beyond the small community kitchen, where she was simply known as the lady who made the soup taste better. She opened her journal, another suggestion from therapy, and wrote, "Day 37 of community service. I'm beginning to understand that the path back to myself is through serving others. The irony isn't lost on me. 6 months had passed since the slap that changed 2 women's lives forever." The video had faded from public consciousness, replaced by newer scandals and viral moments. But for Rose and Diane, the transformation continued long after the cameras stopped rolling. Rose stood at the podium in a hotel ballroom, adjusting the microphone as hundreds of attendees settled into their seats. The Workplace Dignity Foundation's first annual conference had drawn people from across the country: restaurant owners, hotel managers, labor advocates, and service workers themselves. "A year ago, I was just a waitress trying to get through nursing school," Rose began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I never imagined standing before you today. But sometimes life's worst moments lead to unexpected opportunities." From her seat in the front row, Tom gave her an encouraging nod. In 6 short months, their foundation had trained staff at over 50 restaurants, created a hotline for service workers facing abuse, and lobbied successfully for stronger workplace protection laws in 2 states. "Today, I'm honored to introduce someone whose journey has been even more surprising than my own," Rose continued. Her keynote speaker was once on the other side of a viral conflict. Her story demonstrates that change is possible, even from the most unlikely starting points. Rose took a deep breath. "Please welcome Diane Matthews." The audience murmured in surprise as Diane walked onto the stage. Gone were the flashy designer clothes and excessive jewelry. She wore a simple blue dress and carried herself with a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with wealth or status. The 2 women exchanged a brief glance, not quite friends, but no longer enemies. They had spoken only twice since the court case, each conversation slightly less awkward than the last. This joint appearance had been Diane's idea, proposed through a carefully worded email 3 weeks ago. "Thank you, Rose," Diane said, taking her place at the podium. "And thank you all for not walking out when you heard my name." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd. 6 months ago, I was sentenced to community service at a homeless shelter. I thought it was the worst punishment imaginable. Diane paused, looking out at the attentive faces. Instead, it saved me from the person I was becoming. She described her journey, the initial resentment, the gradual connections with people at the shelter, the slow recognition of her own privilege and entitlement. "My 200 hours of service ended 3 months ago," she explained. "But I still go to Hope Center 3 times a week. Not because a judge ordered it, but because I'd found purpose there that my privileged life never gave me." In the audience, Robert watched his wife with undisguised amazement. Their marriage had weathered the storm, emerging stronger as Diane rediscovered her authentic self. He'd been skeptical of her transformation at first, waiting for her to revert to her old ways. But as months passed with no sign of the entitled woman she'd been, he found himself falling in love with her all over again. "The woman I struck that day showed remarkable restraint and dignity," Diane continued, glancing at Rose. She could have responded with equal anger. Instead, she maintained her composure in the face of inexcusable behavior. Diane revealed that she had funded a scholarship for service workers pursuing higher education, named in Rose's honor. She had also joined the board of Hope Center, helping secure donations from her wealthy friends who once only saw her at charity galas. "My community service hours taught me that real fulfillment comes from being of service, not being served," she concluded. "It shouldn't have taken a public disgrace for me to learn this lesson, but I'm grateful it finally got through my thick skull." The audience rose in a standing ovation as Rose joined Diane on stage. The two women stood side by side, the waitress who had found her voice and the socialite who had found her heart. Later, at the reception, they shared a quiet moment away from the crowd. "I never thanked you," Diane said softly. Rose looked puzzled. "For what?" "I didn't do anything." "For not hitting back, literally or figuratively. You could have pressed for harsher penalties or rejected my apology. You had every right to." Rose considered this. "I think we both ended up exactly where we needed to be." They were interrupted by a young waitress serving appetizers. Both women smiled warmly, thanked her by name, and made sure to look her in the eye. Two people forever changed by a single moment that taught them different but equally valuable lessons about human dignity. Outside, spring rain washed the city streets clean as inside. An unlikely partnership continued to heal wounds and create change. Proof that sometimes the hand that strikes can become the hand that helps, and the person who is struck can rise to heights they never imagined.